Body armour. You've already mentioned this. What was the problem with body armour as you understood it?
Well, I think, again, we need to distinguish something. Soldiers for some years prior to Iraq had body armour, a system of protecting their upper bodies. The difficulty that arose was in relation to something, a new system called enhanced combat body armour, which basically consists of a vest with a slot in the front and the back for a metal plate, or a Kevlar plate actually, that protected your vital organs. That was a relatively recent innovation. Indeed, I think prior to the conflict, I don't think it actually was mandatory. It was something that was thought to be desirable. And indeed, we knew we had stocks of around 30,000 plates, so up to 15,000 sets of enhanced combat armour prior to the UOR process. One of the issues that arose as we went through this list was a suggestion that actually we had more than the 15,000 sets, but they weren't in stock. They had already been distributed. So that is one of the reasons why I asked for further advice in relation to enhanced combat body armour, but equally, in my mind also, was the question about visibility and what this would say, because this kind of equipment, it can only really be explained in the context of warfighting. This is not the kind of equipment which, up until then, had been routinely issued to British soldiers. It was available for, and I think the documentation makes this clear, for the fighting echelons, for those who were likely to be in the front line. And the advice that I got in the course of September was that we had enough enhanced combat body armour for the fighting echelon. The question was whether we needed more for all of the forces who were likely to be deployed. And the request that we should. I asked for further advice, partly out of concerns about visibility, partly because of the suggestion that we had more already. Once we got the agreement of the Treasury to proceed with UORs on the 4th of October, we then sent out a further request, basically saying, in the interim, I trust that you will submit for any particularly urgent requirements. So my private office asked that if there was anything at all in the list that had not by then been approved that was a particularly urgent requirement, then we should be told. Not too long after that, we were told that that this was a tranche 2 requirement, so that this was a requirement that was described as being of lower priority.
Sorry, who was this by?
Well, unfortunately, my notes don't say that, but it would have been from the it would be from the logistics team who were preparing the UORs.
Yeah. So tranche 1 is absolutely urgent.
Yep.
Tranche 2 less urgent.
And I think.
Sorry, carry on.
What I understood that to mean at the time was that we had enough in stock for the front line, for those who were going to be fighting. It was desirable, clearly, to have more available, but that the military judged this to be of a lesser priority and did not necessarily say at that stage, as they could have done, that we had to get this equipment available straight away.
Is that in terms of spending the money that the Treasury has already allocated?
Yeah, well, it means going to the manufacturer and saying, please produce another 15 or so thousand sets of this equipment.
So when was it decided?
I think eventually it was decided in November, once the UNSCR had been approved, that the rest of the items were then enhanced enhanced combat body armour.
So we're back to this question of the political impressions being created because this was seen to be much more relevant to offensive operations, and because it wasn't the first priority within defence logistics, the relevant decisions were delayed.
Yeah, well, essentially what they were saying to me was that we have, as I say, 15,000 sets in store. We can use those for the front line, for the fighting echelons. We would like, ideally, more, but that is a lesser priority than some of the other equipment that we require. They were asked about that, and that was confirmed in correspondence, and therefore, as soon as the approval for the UN resolution was agreed, the rest of those items, I suspect not very many by then, were agreed to.
And what were then the problems with the body armour in terms of getting it to the people who needed it?
I think by then, I'm not quite sure of the figures, but I think something like 36,000 sets were shipped to Iraq. Again, from the lessons learned process afterwards, one of the problems was that there was not a very effective tracking system once the containers were unloaded, and I suspect probably what happened was that some units ended up with 2 lots of everything, and some units ended up with nothing. So the distribution on the ground in Iraq was not satisfactory.
And this question of tracking and distribution, I mean, it had been an issue in '91 as well, so it's a bit disappointing that it hadn't been resolved a bit further by 2003.
No, I agree with that, and you know, we over the years we spent quite a bit of time looking at the kinds of solutions that particularly the private sector adopted. I don't know whether it's, obviously I left the Ministry of Defence some years ago, but I mean, one of the ideas was to embed a chip or something in each piece of equipment that allowed you to say where it was in store, how it was being transported and where it was going. But it's a relatively expensive solution. But perhaps, you know, that as the cost of that reduces, that might be a sensible way of proceeding. Otherwise, the tracking necessarily is a manual process with people ticking pieces of paper, which in the circumstances probably unrealistic.
And one of the consequences of this problem was that in key places there weren't enough of the relevant body armour, and so local commanders had to make their own priorities about who should get what, which, as we know, in at least one case led to a tragic outcome.
To the death of Sergeant Roberts.
Yes.
As I understood the process in theatre, that commanding officers essentially made judgments consistent, I think, with what I have been saying, that the front line, the fighting forces would have the enhanced combat body armour, that they would then make judgments about the level of protection available to other soldiers. They already had body armour as such, and the distribution was made on the basis of who was most at risk.
In the nature of the sort of operation which we found ourselves, the dividing line between front and rear became rather blurred.
I think that's absolutely right, and it was a point I made earlier about the rapid advance of the front line, and Sergeant Roberts' death, you know, was an incident that I think perfectly demonstrates your point. They were being stoned by a man who was throwing stones at them. As I understand it, he refused to stop doing that. Sergeant Roberts' gun jammed. The machine gunner fired a machine gun. And I think I'm right in saying that was what killed Sergeant Roberts, because the machine gunner did not entirely appreciate that his machine gun was not accurate at close quarters.